Welcome back to HFY Soundscape, the best channel for HFY sci-fi tales.
The embers of the campfire were nothing but gray ghosts in the pre-dawn light. The girl, now known to herself not as a number or a slave, but as a survivor, sat cross-legged, the rusted knife resting across her knees. Her muscles screamed, a dull, throbbing ache that reminded her of every strike she had landed and every fall she had taken. But it was a good pain. It was the pain of a body that still belonged to her. Across the clearing, the human, Elias, she had finally learned his name in the quiet hours of the night, was meticulously cleaning his gear. He didn't use magic or advanced tech. He used oil, whetstones, and patience. "You're staring," Elias said without looking up. His voice was like low-grade thunder, rolling and steady. "I was thinking about the market," she whispered, her fingers tracing the jagged edge of her blade. "The master of chains. He won't stop at two groups of hunters. You killed his best. You shamed him. In their world, shame is a debt that can only be paid in blood." Elias paused, his gray eyes shifting toward her. "Then we'll make sure it's his blood, not ours. But we can't stay in these woods. The forest was a shield, but now it's a cage. They know we're here. They'll burn the trees down just to smoke us out. Where do we go?" she asked, a flicker of the old fear returning. "My people, they won't take me back. To them, a returned slave is a curse. A reminder of a choice they'd rather forget. We go to the rim sectors," Elias said, standing up. He slung his heavy pack over his shoulder with a grunt. "There's a human enclave there. It's not a paradise, humans rarely build those, but it's a fortress. No slaver dares to cross the perimeter of the Iron Reach unless they want to see how fast a railgun can dismantle a ship." The girl stood, her legs feeling like lead. She looked back at the path they had taken, where the bodies of the hunters lay hidden by the brush. She realized then that she wasn't just running away from something anymore. For the first time in her life, she was running towards something. As they began to move, the terrain changed. The lush, suffocating canopy of the forest gave way to the jagged, obsidian foothills of the scaled peaks. The air grew thinner, tasting of salt and ozone. Elias moved with a predatory grace, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines. He taught her to watch the birds. If they took flight suddenly, someone was moving. He taught her to mask her scent with the crushed needles of the frost pine. By midday, they reached a narrow pass known as the Throat of Sorrows. It was the only way through the mountains toward the human territories. "Wait," Elias signaled, his hand flat. He dropped to a crouch, and she mirrored him instantly. High above, on a natural stone bridge arching over the pass, a metallic glint caught the sun. It wasn't a bird, and it wasn't a hunter's torch. It was a long-range surveillance drone, its unblinking red eye swiveling toward the valley floor. "They're not just sending men anymore," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "They're using the eye. The eye is expensive," Elias muttered, his jaw tightening. "Which means the bounty at our heads just doubled." He looked at her, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver coin, a human credit, worn smooth by years of worry. He pressed it into her hand. "Hold on to that," he said. "In the Reach, that's a promise. It means you're under the protection of the Guild. If we get separated, you find anyone with a scar on their left cheek and show them that. They'll fight for you." "I don't want to get separated," she said firmly, closing her fist over the cold metal. "Neither do I," Elias replied, drawing his sword. The steel sang a low, mournful note. "But the eye has seen us. And the eye always brings the storm." From over the ridge, the mechanical whine of jump jets began to scream. The master of chains hadn't sent hunters this time. He had sent mercenaries. The sound of the jump jets grew from a distant hum to a bone-shaking roar in seconds. 3 black-clad silhouettes plummeted from the sky, stabilized by blue plumes of iron fire before slamming into the rocky earth of the pass. They weren't the ragtag slavers from before. These were wraith stalkers, professional killers for hire, outfitted in pressurized combat suits and kinetic shielding. "Get behind the pillar!" Elias roared, his voice barely audible over the screaming engines. The girl didn't hesitate. She dove behind a jagged obsidian monolith, just as a hail of red plasma bolts stitched a line of molten glass across the ground where she had been standing. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps. This was different. Against the hunters, she had felt a spark of power, a sense that her knife could make a difference. Against these metal-clad giants, she felt like an ant under a descending boot. Elias, however, didn't hide. He moved with a terrifying, calculated speed. As the first mercenary raised a heavy pulse rifle, Elias threw a small, spherical object, a pulse grenade. Crack, a dome of white electrical distortion expanded, short-circuiting the lead mercenary's kinetic shields for a fraction of a second. It was the only window Elias needed. He lunged, his heavy broadsword glowing with the reflected heat of the plasma fire. With a two-handed swing fueled by sheer momentum, he drove the blade through the mercenary's neck seal. Pressurized gas hissed out in a violent spray of white vapor. The giant fell, his armor clattering against the stones like a hollow tin can. "One down!" Elias shouted, but his triumph was short-lived. The other two mercenaries opened fire simultaneously. Elias was forced to dive for cover, his cloak smoking from near misses. He rolled behind the same monolith as the girl, his chest heaving. A streak of blood ran down his temple where a piece of shrapnel had grazed him. "They have sensors," the girl whispered, her eyes wide as she watched the mercenaries methodically flanking their position. "They can see our heat signatures through the stone. We're trapped." Elias looked at her, then at the narrow, crumbling ledge that bypassed the main path. It was a goat track, barely a foot wide, suspended over a 1,000-foot drop into the misty abyss of the throat. "Can you climb?" he asked, his eyes locking onto hers. I don't know," she stammered, looking at the dizzying height. "Look at me," Elias commanded, grabbing her shoulder. His hand was hot, trembling slightly from the adrenaline. The girl in the cage couldn't climb this. But the girl who stabbed the collector? She can. You have to go up. If you reach the upper ridge, there's a loose rockfall. If you can trigger it, you'll cut off their line of sight. I'll draw their fire. You'll die, she said, her voice breaking. I'm harder to kill than I look. Elias gave her a grim, bloody smirk. On 3. 1, 2, go. He stepped out from behind the pillar, firing a compact slug thrower he'd kept hidden in his boot. The mercenaries shifted their focus, their heavy rifles tracking his movement as he darted between the rocks. The girl scrambled onto the ledge. Her fingers bled as she clawed at the sharp obsidian. The wind howled, trying to pluck her from the mountainside, and the sound of plasma fire echoed below like rhythmic thunder. She didn't look down. She focused only on the next handhold, the next jagged lip of stone. She reached the upper ridge just as a massive explosion rocked the pass. A mercenary had fired a micromissile. She looked down and saw Elias buried under a pile of debris, his sword lying several feet away. The two remaining wraiths were closing in, their boots crunching on the gravel, their weapons leveled at the fallen human's head. "No!" she screamed, though the wind swallowed her voice. She saw the rock fall Elias had mentioned, a precarious pile of boulders held back by a single weathered limestone pillar. She didn't have a lever. She didn't have a hammer. She looked at the rusted knife in her hand. It was a weak tool, a slave's tool. But she remembered Elias's voice. Use speed. Weak points. She threw herself at the base of the limestone pillar, driving her weight and her blade into a deep crack in the stone, kicking and heaving with every ounce of fury she possessed. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a groan echoed through the mountain. The pillar snapped. A deluge of stone and earth roared down the mountainside like a tidal wave. The mercenaries had half a second to look up before the mountain itself collapsed upon them. The valley went silent, shrouded in a thick, choking cloud of gray dust. The dust hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating shroud. The girl scrambled down the ridge, sliding on loose shale, her lungs burning from the fine powdered stone. She reached the valley floor, her hands frantically clawing at the debris where she had last seen Elias. "Elias!" She choked out, her voice raspy. "Elias, answer me." A gloved hand erupted from the rubble, followed by a violent cough. She lunged forward, heaving away a jagged slab of obsidian. Elias dragged himself out, his face a mask of gray dust and crimson blood. His armor was cracked, and his breath came in ragged, wheezing hitches. He looked at the massive mound of stone that had buried the wraithstalkers, then back at her. "You!" "Triggered it," he wheezed, a ghost of a smile touching his cracked lips. "Told you. You could climb." He tried to stand, but his right leg buckled with a sickening pop. He fell back against a boulder, his face turning a ghostly shade of white. The girl knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his leg, trembling. "I need to fix this," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She remembered the healers in her village, the way they used pressure and binding before the slavers took them all. She stripped her outer tunic, tearing the fabric into long, sturdy strips. "Listen to me." Elias gripped her wrist, his strength fading. "The drone, the eye is still up there. It saw the landslide. It knows we survived. They'll send a retrieval craft. We have less than an hour to get into the blind zone, the caves beneath the peaks. I can't carry you," she whispered, looking at his massive frame. "You don't carry me," he grunted, reaching for his discarded sword and using it as a crutch to heave himself upright. "You lead me, and if I fall, you take the coin and you run. I'm done running without you," she snapped, stepping under his arm to take his weight. Together, they hobbled toward the dark maw of the mountain. Every step was a battle. Elias was heavy, his breathing sounding like sandpaper on wood, but he refused to let go of his weapon. Behind them, the faint, high-pitched whine of an approaching ship began to vibrate in the air. They slipped into the mouth of the cavern just as a sleek black dropship crested the mountain ridge. Its searchlights swept the valley, illuminating the graveyard of stone she had created. Inside the cave, the temperature plummeted. The walls were damp, smelling of ancient earth and cold iron. They moved deep into the darkness, guided only by a small chemical light stick Elias cracked open. The blue glow cast long dancing shadows against the stalactites. "We have to stop," the girl said, feeling Elias's weight becoming more than she could support. "You're bleeding through the bandages." She lowered him onto a flat shelf of rock. In the dim blue light, she saw the extent of the damage. A piece of the mercenary's kinetic plating had sliced deep into his side, and his leg was badly dislocated. "The pack," Elias whispered, gesturing to his bag. "Bottom pocket. A silver canister. It's a stim shot, human tech. It'll stop the internal bleeding, but it'll knock me out for a few hours. My body has to repair the shock." She found the canister. It looked alien and cold. "If you're asleep and they find us, then you use that knife," Elias said, his eyes locking onto hers one last time. "Don't aim for the armor. Aim for the gaps, the joints, the eyes. You're not a slave anymore. You're the shadow in the dark." He took the canister, pressed it against his thigh, and triggered it. A hiss of pressurized medicine followed. Within seconds, his head fell back, and his breathing deepened into a heavy, drug-induced slumber. The girl sat in the silence, the blue light stick fading. She clutched her rusted knife, her eyes fixed on the cave entrance. Outside, she could hear the muffled thrum of the dropship circling, searching. For the first time, she wasn't the one being protected. She was the sentry. She was the shield. And as she sat there in the dark, she realized she wasn't shaking anymore. The silence of the cave was deceptive. It wasn't truly silent. It was a symphony of drips, the groan of shifting rock and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of Elias's drug-induced breathing. The blue light stick flickered, casting long skeletal shadows that seemed to dance toward the cave entrance. The girl sat perfectly still. She had positioned herself in the deepest shadow, just behind a cluster of jagged stalagmites. Her rusted knife felt warm in her hand, the metal seemingly humming with the heat of her grip. She watched the mouth of the cave. Outside, the world was awash of silver moonlight and the occasional sweep of a high-intensity searchlight from the orbiting dropship. "You are the shadow in the dark," Elias had said. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to listen. She filtered out the sound of the wind. She filtered out the drip of water. And then she heard it, the soft metallic clink of a magnetic boot against stone. They weren't using the ship to find them anymore. They had sent a scout. A single figure silhouetted against the moonlit entrance. It wasn't a wraithstalker in heavy plating. This was a tracker, a lean alien with 4 eyes that glowed a faint, predatory yellow in the dark. It carried a long, needle-thin shock lance and moved with the unsettling fluidity of an insect. The tracker stopped, its head tilting as its multifaceted eyes scanned the heat signatures of the cave. It hissed a low, vibrating sound that signaled it had found something. It had picked up the lingering warmth of the stim shot in Elias's system. The girl's heart didn't race. Instead, it slowed. A strange, icy calm settled over her. She knew she couldn't fight this creature head-on. Its reach was too long, its reflexes too fast. She had to be what Elias taught her, the weak point in the enemy's plan. The tracker stepped deeper into the cave, its lance humming with lethal electricity. It passed the first cluster of stalagmites. It was barely 3 feet from where Elias lay unconscious. The girl didn't stand. She lunged from her crouch, staying low to the ground. She didn't scream. She didn't aim for the chest. As the tracker spun to face the movement, she drove her blade into the creature's lower knee joint, where the chitinous armor was thinnest to allow for movement. The tracker shrieked, a high-pitched warble that echoed off the cavern walls. It thrust its shock lance downward, but the girl had already rolled away, using the momentum to get behind the creature's back. She remembered the anatomy Elias had pointed out on his own body. Here, the base of the skull. As the tracker struggled to turn on its ruined leg, she leaped onto its back, her small weight throwing it off balance. She wrapped one arm around its neck and, with a singular desperate burst of strength, drove her knife into the soft tissue at the base of its head. The creature shuddered once, the electricity in its lance sparking wildly against the cave floor before going dark. It slumped forward, dead before it hit the ground. The girl fell back, gasping, her hands slick with the tracker's violet blood. She looked at her hands, then at the fallen monster, then at the sleeping human. She had killed again. But this time, it wasn't a frantic accident or a desperate mountain slide. It was a hunt. She quickly dragged the tracker's body deeper into the shadows, covering the violet blood with handfuls of dry cave dust. She took the creature's shock lance. It was heavy and awkward, but it gave her range. She returned to her post, leaning against the cold stone beside Elias. She watched the entrance, waiting for the sun to rise or for the next shadow to fall. She was no longer just a girl who had been saved. She was a guardian. When the first pale rays of dawn finally touched the cave floor, Elias stirred. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He looked around, disoriented, until his gaze fell on the girl. She was sitting there, the shock lance across her lap, her face smeared with dirt and dried violet blood. "You're awake," she said, her voice sounding older, harder. Elias looked at the scuff marks on the floor, then at the dark shape of the dead tracker in the corner. He looked back at her, his storm-gray eyes filled with a new kind of respect. "I am," Elias whispered, his voice rasping. "And it looks like I owe you my life, again." "The debt is settled, Elias," she said, standing up and offering him a hand. "Now, let's get to the reach. I'm tired of being hunted." The journey out of the blind zone was a grueling test of endurance. Elias leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch, his face tight with the effort of every step, but the stim shot had done its work. The internal bleeding had stopped, and his gray eyes remained sharp. The girl led the way, the captured shock lance held ready. She moved with a new rhythm, her eyes no longer downcast but scanning the ridgelines for the telltale glint of drones. "We're close," Elias wheezed as they crested the final obsidian ridge. Look, below them, the jagged mountains fell away into a vast salt-crusted plain. In the center of that white wasteland sat a structure that looked less like a city and more like a wound in the earth. It was a massive, circular fortress of blackened steel, surrounded by rings of automated turret towers and humming energy fences. This was the Iron Reach. It looks angry, the girl whispered. It has to be, Elias replied. In a galaxy that wants to put a collar on anything that breathes, the Reach is the only place that bites back, but getting in is the trick. The automated systems don't care about stories. They care about ID codes. As they descended toward the plane, the air grew heavy with the smell of ozone and industrial grease. The silence of the salt flats was broken by the occasional thump hiss of the Reach's perimeter cannons test-firing into the distance. Suddenly, the ground beneath them vibrated. A section of the salt crust burst upward as 3 hover bikes, low, jagged machines built for speed tore toward them. The riders wore mismatched armor and helmets shaped like predatory skulls. Scavengers, Elias cursed, drawing his sword despite the pain in his leg. They hang around the perimeter like vultures, waiting for anyone the Reach rejects. The lead biker circled them, kicking up a rooster tail of white salt. He killed his engine, the bike settling into a low hum. He pulled off his helmet, revealing a human face covered in jagged, self-inflicted scars. He looked at Elias's battered armor, then at the girl, his eyes lingering on her alien features with a hungry, speculative glint. "That's a fine piece of property you've got there, traveler," the scavenger sneered, his voice wet and raspy. "Looks a bit high-strung, but she'd fetch a pretty price at the southern hub. Tell you what give her to us, and we'll let you crawl the rest of the way to the gate. You look like you're about to fall over anyway." Elias's grip tightened on his hilt, but before he could speak, the girl stepped forward. She didn't hide behind him. She leveled the shock lance at the scavenger's throat, the blue tip of the weapon crackling with lethal energy. "I am not property," she said, her voice cold and resonant. "And he is not crawling." The scavenger laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Feisty. I like them feisty. Boys, take her." The other 2 bikers reached for their kinetic prods, but they never finished the motion. From the direction of the fortress, a sound like a cracking whip tore through the air. A hypersonic slug slammed into the ground inches from the lead scavenger's boot, vaporizing the salt into a cloud of steam. "Perimeter violation," a booming metallic voice echoed from the fortress towers. "Disengage or be deleted." The scavengers froze. They knew the Reach's reputation. Without a word, the leader jammed his helmet back on, revved his engine, and the 3 bikes vanished into a cloud of white dust, fleeing back into the wastes. Elias let out a long, shaky breath, sheathing his sword. Cutting it a bit close, they reached the massive blast doors of the outer wall. A heavy surveillance eye swiveled down, scanning them with a blue laser. "Elias Thorne, rank Vanguard," Elias spoke into the intercom, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Requesting asylum for 2. I have the girl's debt token." The laser lingered on the girl's face, then moved to the small silver coin she held tightly in her hand. There was a long, agonizing silence where the only sound was the wind whistling through the steel girders. Then, with a groan of heavy hydraulics, the doors began to rise. "Welcome home, Thorne," the voice said, sounding slightly more human. "Though the commander is going to have words about the mess you brought with you." Elias looked at the girl and leaned his head against hers for a fleeting second, ready to see how humans live. She looked into the dark industrial heart of the fortress. As long as there are no cages, the interior of the Iron Reach was a shock to the senses. If the forest was a green lung and the salt flats a white void, the Reach was a grinding, smoking heart of iron. The air tasted of ozone, recycled oxygen, and burnt oil. Massive pipes hissed overhead, and the constant low-frequency hum of a geothermal core vibrated through the soles of the girl's feet. Humans were everywhere. They didn't move at the graceful, haughty steps of her own people or the jittery aggression of the slavers. They moved with a hurried, heavy-set purpose. Engineers in grease-stained coveralls, soldiers in dented ceramic plate, and traders shouting over the din of hydraulic presses. As Elias and the girl walked, Elias now supported by two stern-faced human guards, the crowd parted. Eyes followed them. Not eyes of worship or even of cruelty, but eyes of intense, weary curiosity. "Med bay first," one of the guards grunted. "The commander can wait until you're not leaking on the deck plating." Thorn. The infirmary was a sterile white bubble in the middle of the dark fortress. They forced the girl to wait in a hallway while they took Elias behind a heavy pressure door. For the first hour, she paced. She clutched her shock lance, but a technician had politely, yet firmly, taken it from her to neutralize the cell. She felt naked without it. "You look like you're ready to spring a leak, kid." She spun around. Sitting on a crate nearby was a woman with skin the color of deep mahogany and a mechanical arm that whirred softly as she sharpened a small pocket knife. Her eyes were kind, but they held the same storm-gray hardness she saw in Elias. "I am waiting for Elias," the girl said defiantly. "Elias is a mule," the woman chuckled. "He survived 3 planetary purges and a run-in with a void kraken. A broken leg and a scratch on the ribs won't stop him." "I'm Sarah. I served with him in the 3rd Vanguard," he said. "He said humans protect their own here," the girl whispered, looking at the busy hallway. "But I am not human." Sarah stopped sharpening her blade. She looked at the girl, really looked at her, seeing the dried violet blood on her tunic and the way her hand hovered over where her knife used to be. "In the Reach, human isn't about how many fingers you have or what color your blood is," Sarah said, pointing her knife toward the silver coin the girl still wore on a string around her neck. "It's about who stands beside you when the lights go out. You brought him back alive. That makes you more human than half the scum in this sector." The pressure door hissed open. Elias emerged, his leg encased in a high-tech kinetic brace and a fresh synth patch over his side. He looked pale, but he was standing on his own. "Commander's ready," Elias said, his voice stronger. He reached out and squeezed the girl's shoulder. "Stay close. He's going to ask a lot of questions. Just tell him the truth." They were led to the Crow's Nest, a command center overlooking the entire fortress. Behind a desk made of salvaged starship plating sat a man whose face looked like a topographical map of a war zone. Commander Vane didn't look up from his holographic displays as they entered. "Thorn," Vane rasped. "You went out for a routine scouting mission and came back with a mountain slide, 3 dead wraiths, and a bounty on your head large enough to buy a small moon. Care to explain why the Master of Chains is currently broadcasting a kill-on-sight order for every human in the neutral zone?" "Because he's a slaver, sir," Elias said calmly. "And I don't like slavers." Vane finally looked up, his gaze landing on the girl. "And her?" "The reports say she's the one who triggered the landslide. That she's the one who took down a tracker solo. She's a survivor, Commander," Elias said. "And a member of this guild." Vane stood up, walking around the desk. He stopped in front of the girl. He was a head shorter than Elias, but he felt like a mountain. "The Master of Chains has sent an ultimatum. He wants the girl, and he wants the man who stole her. If we don't hand you over in 48 hours, he's bringing his private fleet to our doorstep." The girl's heart stopped. She looked at Elias, then back at Vane. I will go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't let your people die for me." Vane looked at her for a long, silent moment. Then, he turned to a terminal and pressed a button. Across the entire Reach, a deep, resonant siren began to wail. "Did you hear that, girl?" Vane asked. "What is it?" "That's the sound of the Reach closing its doors," Vane said, a cold, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Humans have a lot of flaws. But we're very, very bad at giving back what's ours. If the Master wants you, he's going to have to burn this rock to the bedrock to get you." The next 48 hours were a blur of motion and metal. The Iron Reach transformed from a trading post into a war machine. The business-as-usual atmosphere vanished, replaced by the rhythmic thud-thud of heavy artillery being calibrated and the high-pitched whine of energy shields being pushed to their limits. Elias spent his time in the armory, but he wasn't alone. He insisted the girl join him. If they breach the walls, Elias said, handing her a new weapon, the shock lance won't be enough. You need something for close quarters that doesn't rely on batteries. He handed her a blade that looked like a sliver of the midnight sky. It was made of folded carbon steel, weighted perfectly for her smaller grip. It wasn't a slave's rusted knife. It was a soldier's short sword. This is Vanguard steel, Elias explained. It's forged with a magnetic core. If you hit a kinetic shield with enough force, the blade's frequency will shatter the barrier. It's a tool for killing giants. The girl took the sword, her fingers curling around the leather-wrapped hilt. She felt the weight of it not as a burden, but as a responsibility. Around them, Sarah and the other veterans were sharpening their own gear, sharing grim jokes, and checking their ammunition counts. Are you afraid? The girl asked Sarah. Sarah paused, checking the seal on her mechanical arm. Kid, only a fool isn't afraid before a fleet arrives. But there's a difference between fear that freezes you and fear that sharpens you. Use the sharpened kind. As the deadline approached, the girl climbed to the highest walkway of the crow's nest. She looked out over the salt flats. The white expanse was no longer empty. On the horizon, dark shapes were descending from the clouds, massive, beetle-like carrier ships emblazoned with the golden chain symbol of the slave master. Elias joined her, leaning on the railing. His kinetic brace hissed as he shifted his weight. He's brought everything, the girl whispered, watching the sky darken with drop pods. He's made a mistake, Elias replied. He thinks he's attacking a fortress. He doesn't realize he's attacking a family. He thinks we're protecting a piece of property. He doesn't understand that you're one of us now. Why, Elias? She turned to him, her voice thick with emotion. Why would all these people risk their lives for one alien girl they don't even know? Elias looked out at the approaching army, then back at her. Because most of the people in this reach were property, once too. Sarah was a mine slave on a moon you've never heard of. Vane was sold by his own government to a biolab. Well, that's a story for another time. We all found our way here because someone reached out a hand instead of a collar. Suddenly, the floor beneath them groaned. A deep bass vibration shook the entire fortress. He's ranging us, Elias said, his face hardening. A massive plume of salt erupted a mile out as the first orbital strike hit the perimeter. The sky turned a bruised purple as the Reach's energy shields flickered into life, absorbing the heat of the blast. Go to the lower barracks, Elias commanded, his voice switching to his soldier tone. Help Sarah with the civilians and the wounded. If the gates blow, you're the last line of defense. Do you understand? I understand, she said. She didn't argue. She knew her role. She turned to go, but Elias caught her hand. For a brief second, he pulled her into a fierce protective embrace. Fight hard, little shadow. I will, she whispered into his chest. She sprinted down the stairs as the second blast hit, closer this time. The war for the Reach had begun, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't the prize being fought over, she was the warrior fighting back. The world became a symphony of violence. Above, the orbital bombardments hammered the Reach's shields like the fist of a vengeful god, turning the salt flats into a landscape of molten glass. Below, in the lower barracks, the air was thick with the smell of scorched metal and medicinal chemicals. The girl moved among the shadows of the reinforced bunker. She was no longer the one needing comfort. She was the one providing it. She helped Sarah move crates of ammunition and assisted the medics in stanching the wounds of those brought down from the upper walls. They're through the first perimeter. A voice crackled over the intercom. The master is dropping iron crawlers directly onto the docking bays. A massive shudder rocked the fortress deeper and more violent than any orbital strike. The sound of metal screaming against metal echoed through the ventilation shafts. One of the slave master's massive boarding craft had slammed into the side of the Reach. its serrated hull cutting through the black steel like a hot knife through wax. "Sarah," the girl shouted over the din. "I know, kid. The breach is in Sector 4. Sarah racked the slide on her heavy pulse rifle, her mechanical arm whirring with high-torque power. "That's right above the civilian shelters. If they get through the bulkhead, it's a slaughter." "I'm going with you," the girl said, her hand tightening around the hilt of her Vanguard blade. Sarah looked at her, seeing the fierce, unwavering light in the girl's alien eyes. "Keep low. Watch my 6. If you see a slaver, don't wait for a greeting, take the heart." They sprinted through the flickering corridors. The emergency lights bathed the walls in a rhythmic, bloody red. As they reached the bulkhead of Sector 4, the door exploded inward. A squad of butchers, the Master's elite shock troops, lunged through the smoke. They were massive bio-augmented brutes with neural whips and heavy cleavers. They didn't want to kill. They wanted to disable and collect. Sarah opened fire, her pulse rifle spitting streaks of blue light that tore through the lid butcher's armor. But there were too many. A neural whip lashed out, wrapping around Sarah's mechanical arm and discharging a surge of electricity that sent her staggering back, her limbs sparking and dead. One of the butchers, a hulking creature with a face hidden behind a rusted iron mask, saw the girl. He let out a low, guttural laugh. "There you are, little runaway. The Master says you're worth a fortune in one piece." But he didn't say anything about your legs. He lunged, his heavy cleaver swinging in a wide, clumsy arc. The girl didn't freeze. She didn't scream. She remembered Elias's training. Weak points. Use their size against them. She slid beneath the swing, her small frame moving with a fluid grace the brute couldn't track. As she passed, she drove the Vanguard blade upward. The magnetic core of the sword hummed as it hit the butcher's kinetic belt, the frequency shattering the shield with a sound like breaking glass. The blade sank deep into the gap between his thigh plate and torso. The brute roared, but she didn't stop. She kicked off his knee, spinning behind him, and slashed the back of his neck where the armor met the helmet. He collapsed into the dirt and smoke, a mountain of flesh brought down by a shadow. Sarah recovered, using her good arm to fire her sidearm, taking down the last of the squad. She looked at the girl, then at the fallen butcher. "I guess Elias taught you more than just how to climb," Sarah panted, her face covered in soot. But the girl wasn't looking at Sarah. She was looking at the breach. Through the smoke, she could see a figure standing on the boarding ramp of the enemy ship. He was draped in fine silks that contrasted sharply with the carnage around him. He held a staff topped with a golden head. It was the Master of Chains. He had come to claim his property personally. "He's here," she whispered, her voice cold with a fury she hadn't known she possessed. "And I'm going to show him exactly what I'm worth." The air in the breach was a cocktail of ozone and the metallic tang of blood. The Master of Chains stepped off his boarding ramp, his silk robes fluttering in the violent drafts created by the Reach's failing life support. He looked at the girl, not as a person, but as a ledger entry that refused to be balanced. "You have caused a great deal of damage to my overhead, little thing," the Master said, his voice amplified by a neck-mounted vocoder. It sounded like grinding stones. "Entire squads lost, a collector destroyed, a human fortress besieged. All for a creature that should be scrubbing floors in a spice mine." Sarah tried to raise her pistol, but the Master flicked his wrist. A kinetic pulse from his staff sent her flying back against the bulkhead, knocking the wind from her lungs. "Elias!" The girl screamed, her eyes darting around the smoke-filled corridor. "Your human is busy," the Master sneered. "My elite guard is dismantling him on the upper decks as we speak. He will die thinking he saved you, which is the most pathetic human trait of all, hope." The Master began to walk toward her, the golden head of his staff glowing with a sickly yellow light. "Drop the toy, girl. Come back to your cage, and I might leave your hands intact." The girl's knuckles were white as she gripped the Vanguard blade. She felt the fear, but it was no longer a cold weight. It was fuel. She thought of her parents' cold silence, the iron bars of the market, and the warmth of Elias's hand on her shoulder. "I am not a thing," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "And I don't belong to you." She lunged. The master was fast, his staff parrying her strike with a crack of energy that sent a numbing shock up her arms. He swung the staff, catching her in the ribs and sending her sprawling. She rolled, gasping for air, and barely dodged a follow-up blast of kinetic energy that pulverized the floor where her head had been. "You were taught by a soldier," the master mocked, "but you are still just a child of a weak race. Your people were born to serve. It is in your blood." The girl scrambled to her feet, her vision blurring. She saw the master raising his staff for a finishing blow. But then, she noticed it. The master's silk robes were snagged on a piece of jagged metal from the breach. It was a tiny, insignificant anchor. "Weak points," Elias's voice echoed in her mind. "Sometimes it's not about the armor. It's about the environment." Instead of attacking the master, she drove her blade into a nearby high-pressure steam pipe. A jet of scalding white vapor exploded into the corridor, obscuring the master's vision and filling the air with a deafening hiss. The master roared in frustration, swinging his staff blindly. The girl dropped to her belly, crawling beneath the fog of steam. She knew this corridor. She had scrubbed these floors with Sarah just hours before. She felt the vibration of the master's heavy boots. He was turning, trying to find his prize. She saw his silhouette through the mist, the silk of his robes billowing. She didn't aim for his heart. She aimed for the kinetic battery holstered at his hip that powered his staff and his personal shields. She lunged from the steam like a vengeful ghost. The Vanguard blade, humming with its magnetic core, bit into the battery pack. Boom! The feedback loop triggered a localized EMP. The master's shields shattered and his staff went dark. The force of the explosion threw them both apart. The master hit the deck hard, his finery scorched. His mask cracked open to reveal a pale, terrified face beneath. The girl stood over him, the Vanguard blade held at his throat. Her breath was ragged, her tunic torn, but her eyes were twin fires of defiance. "My people were sold because of monsters like you," she said, the tip of the sword drawing a thin line of violet blood on his neck. "But I was bought by a man who taught me how to end you. Wait!" The master hissed, his voice finally stripping away the mechanical bravado. "I can make you rich. I can give you your own planet. Just let me go back to my ship." The girl looked at the boarding ramp, then back at the master. She saw Sarah struggling to her feet in the background. "I don't want a planet," the girl said. "I want the debt paid." The master of chains looked up at the girl, his eyes wide with a realization that came too late. He had spent his life quantifying existence in credits and hulls, never understanding that some spirits grow stronger the more they are compressed. "The debt," the girl whispered, her voice cold as the void, "is settled." She didn't strike. Instead, she stepped back and lowered her blade. The master blinked, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his broken staff. "A wise choice, girl. You've learned the first rule of power. Survival is—" The words died in his throat as a heavy, metallic thud echoed from the darkness behind him. Out of the steam and shadows stepped Elias Thorne. His armor was shattered, his face was a mask of soot and blood, and his heavy broadsword was notched, but he was standing. Behind him stood Commander Vane and a dozen Vanguard soldiers, their weapons leveled and glowing with lethal intent. The master spun around, his silk robes dragging in the grime. He looked at the boarding ramp of his ship, then at the wall of steel closing in on him. "Your fleet is retreating, Master," Vane rasped, his voice echoing through the breached hull. "We've boarded your flagship, your property has been liberated. And as for you, the Reach doesn't have cages. But we do have a very long walk across the salt flats." Elias walked past the master as if he were nothing more than a ghost. He stopped in front of the girl, his gray eyes searching hers. He saw the blood on her blade, the soot on her brow, and the steadiness in her hands. He didn't see a girl he had saved. He saw a peer. "You're okay," Elias said, his voice thick with relief. "I am," she replied, finally letting the Vanguard blade rest at her side. "And Sarah is safe." Elias looked at the Master of Chains, who was being hauled away in heavy magnetic cuffs. The man who had terrorized a sector was now just a small shivering figure in ruined silks. "What happens to him?" she asked. "He'll face a tribunal of the free sectors," Elias said. "He'll spend the rest of his days rebuilding the lives he tore apart. It's a human punishment, making a monster useful." The battle for the Iron Reach ended as the sun began to climb over the salt flats. The fires were being extinguished, and the long process of repair had begun. But the atmosphere wasn't one of mourning, it was one of triumph. A week later, the girl stood on the outer ramparts of the fortress. Her new short sword was strapped to her hip, and the silver coin, the token of the guild, was no longer hidden, but worn proudly over her tunic. Elias joined her, his kinetic brace removed, walking with only a slight limp. They looked out at the horizon where the salt flats met the sky. "The Reach is safe for now," Elias said. But the Master had partners. "The markets are still open in the southern hubs." The girl turned to him. She wasn't the trembling child from the cage anymore. Her posture was straight, her gaze unwavering. "Then we have work to do." Elias smiled a real, genuine smile that reached his storm-gray eyes. He extended his hand, not to lead her, but to walk beside her. "I was hoping you'd say that. There's a transport leaving for the Rim tonight. They say there's a group of survivors hiding in the asteroid belts who need a shield." She placed her hand in his, her grip firm and sure. "They don't just need a shield, Elias. They need to learn how to fight." Together, they walked back into the heart of the Reach. The alien girl who was betrayed by her own blood had found more than safety. She had found a name, a family, and a purpose. She was no longer a story of what happens when you are sold. She was the legend of what happens when you refuse to stay broken. The end. If you enjoyed this journey of betrayal, survival, and the unbreakable human spirit, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to HFY Soundscape for more epic sci-fi stories.